Mormon Mental Health Podcast is a production of the Open Stories Foundation and relies on donations from its listeners like you. To help keep this podcast alive, please consider becoming a monthly subscriber. Any amount will make a difference. You can click the right-hand donate button on mormonmentalhealth.org. All contributions are tax-deductible within the United States and go towards podcast production and building community support and program development for Mormons on various paths and journeys. Thank you for listening. Hello and welcome to another episode of Mormon Mental Health Podcast, and actually a co-production with Mormon Sex Info podcast. I am really excited to have two very good colleagues of mine, people I've worked with in the past and had really great interactions with. But before I go into introducing them and the topic, I'd like to just give a few announcements. So I'm going to be in Utah this coming weekend. So in just a week, doing a workshop for people who are struggling with faith transitions in any shape, way, or form. Usually people who enjoy coming to these events are people who want to nuance their faith, stay involved in Mormonism, maybe in some way or another, even though they're moving away from maybe more orthodox stances, and how to do that in health promoting ways. Also, really good fit for mixed faith marriages or mixed faith families that want to help bridge understandings, things of that nature. We talk about parenting, all those kinds of things. So if you're interested in anything like that, please visit my website, natashaparker.org. That's the Mormon Matters retreat that I'll be doing with Dan Witherspoon. The other thing I just always remind people of is if you're finding these podcasts helpful, I can't do it without your financial support. So it's completely donation supported. And so please consider a donation if you're not already a donor. If you are, thank you so very much for being so. You can do that either monthly or, like a subscription, or you can just do a one-time donation. I always say that if everybody who listened just donated $1, I'd have no issues fundraising. So it doesn't take a lot to be supportive of the podcast. And then I also want to just say that for those who are Mormon Sex Info listeners, that's a subscription-based, but that's going to be changing here in the next few weeks. So stay tuned for how I'm going to try to make the Mormon Sex Info podcast more sustainable as well. I'm thinking instead of going from subscription-based, I'm going to go more donor-based as well, so that more people can access, even if they're not necessarily donors at the time. So that's my announcements for the near future. Today, I'm very excited to talk about a program that's been going on for a while now at Brigham Young University in Provo. It's really group therapy that deals with sexual concerns. And two of the people who are very involved in providing these programs have joined me today. Michael Buxton and Marty Erickson have joined me, and I'm very excited about this topic because I think that there's a lot of room for psychoeducation, for work on shame, and all the things that we've talked about in these podcasts for a long time in regards to sexuality, and starting at a point where young people have great potential to either head in a shaming kind of negative direction or a sex positive direction. And I've been really enthused with how sex positive I believe this program is. So I want to introduce it and get to hear those who are involved with it. So why don't I start off with my colleague, Dr. Marty Erickson, just to introduce yourself, just so people know. Marty and I have worked a long time together as board members for the Mormon Mental Health Association. So that's a big part of how I know him. And he's currently now the new president of the Mormon Mental Health Association. So he's going to be taking that role over. He was elected just this last few months. So welcome, Marty, to the program. Tell me a little bit more about yourself.
Great. Thanks, Natasha. Yeah, great to be on. Thanks for this opportunity. It'll be fun to talk about this today. So I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I did both the master's and a PhD in that. And I've worked at BYU Counseling and Psychological Services doing therapy with students for a little over 8 years now, 8.5 years or so. And I've been a therapist a little over 20 years. I work with individuals, couples, families, and then this group therapy. And one of the reasons I really wanted to work at BYU was because I had talked with Mike Buxton a little bit and some of the other developers of this sexual concerns group, and it sounded very interesting to me and something I wanted to be a part of. So that was one of the reasons that I applied and eventually was hired at BYU. I work there part-time, and I work in private practice at Alliance Behavioral Psychology, group private practice in Orem, part-time. I've been doing that for about 10 years or so. And in my work at BYU, I help run these SC groups, we call them, sexual concerns groups. And I also do a lot of individual therapy with students and some couples therapy with students. And I run a premarital workshop as well, which has some overlay with this a bit, because we talk about healthy sexuality, of course, for new BYU couples. And we don't talk a ton about sexual concerns like pornography issues or things like that, but there is a little bit of overlap, which is kind of fun. That's me. I'm married, have 2 kids, have 3 kids. Oh my goodness. I have 3 children.
Did you forget one of your kids?
That's weird. 12, 10, can we edit that? 12, 10.
I think that's a beautiful, like, little Freudian slip. I like to think I have less children than I do as well sometimes. All right. Thank you so much for that. And then Dr. Michael Buxton. So I met you at an ASECT conference several years ago now, and where you were presenting, I believe, with Dr. Jennifer from Layson Fife,
right,
and had a wonderful lunch with you, got to know you and a lot of the things that you're working on. And you also helped us get the Mormon Mental Health Association kind of going by being one of our first presenters. So please introduce yourself further.
Well, thanks, Natasha. I'm a lot of the things that Marty said are things that I also do at counseling and psychological services at BYU. I'm a full-time faculty member. I've been there for 20 years now, which means I started in January of 1999, which was really like when the internet was up and running, up and going. It was more integrated by that point into people's lives and their academic lives, certainly. And that plays a large role, right, in so many of these issues we're going to talk about today, and which prompted a need for this kind of a group therapy. But let's see, by way of about me, I'm, I don't know what to say. What should I say, Natasha?
What's your training? Where did you go to school? What's your background?
And my undergraduate was as an undergrad at BYU. And then I'm from Ohio, is where I grew up, and my wife, and we had a kid there, and then went to BYU. But then I went to the University of Georgia for a master's and a PhD in marriage and family therapy. That's where I got a lot of good training.
Okay. And maybe a question I would ask both of you right from the offset is, how did you get interested in working along these issues of sexual concerns to begin with? So how did sexuality become an area of interest for both of you?
Sure. In my training, I was doing my master's degree starting in 1995. And I had graduated, let's see here, is that right? 96? But I graduated from BYU in 94. And one thing of note, I think, with all of this is BYU moved from DOS-based computer systems on campus to Windows-based systems in the fall of, I think, 94 or 95. And so as Mike was mentioning earlier, I think internet pornography, of course, was big right from the start there. And then when I was doing my master's training in marriage and family therapy, I talked with a bishop once, and he said, "Do you work with pornography problems?" And I was near the end of my master's program, and I had worked quite a bit with LDS couples, and I had worked for LDS Social Services, it was called at the time. And I said, "Yes, I'm doing some of that work. I was getting some introduction to some of that work." And he said, "Oh, we just thought you didn't do that since you're a marriage and family therapist." And I realized, oh, well, maybe this is going to be a big part of my work moving forward. And I didn't really know how to wrap my mind around it or how to make sense of it much. And so I started investigating various ways people were talking about how to work with it from a faith-based, religious, or LDS perspective, from a feminist perspective, from some other perspectives. Did that for a few years. That seemed very ineffective, didn't work very well. And eventually was introduced to some of the ideas that this sexual concerns group is based on, and I found that much more effective. Plus, just I had an interest in healthy sexuality in general, just as a marriage and family therapist. I have done quite a bit of sex therapy with couples. I don't have certificate training or ASEC training. I would like to eventually someday, but I think being a marriage and family therapist has me trafficking in sexuality quite a bit.
Right. You would think. All right. What about you, Michael? Yes.
Yeah, that sounds really similar to me. Also, just as a couple, as a marriage therapist, couples therapist, I remember like really early on in my training, one of my supervisors asking me how I talk to couples about sex. And I said, I really try to avoid talking to couples about sex. He goes, no. Those days are in the past. Not only do you need to talk about it, you need to become expert, right, in how to work with couples around those all kinds of issues. And so from that point forward, yes, as a good couples therapist, you have to know how to work. And so taking that, and then when I moved to Utah 20 years ago, there just seemed to be like this big need for people who knew how to work like with pornography and people that were looking at that and sexual issues. Moving from other environments into Utah, it's pretty stunning in strong Mormon communities like BYU, just how really uptight and how afraid, how guilty, how concerned people are about these issues, how much it's talked about.
Right. So that gets us right to the point. I mean, right before we get started on how you develop the program and the history of the program, I mean, there is some research indicating that, of course, those coming from conservative backgrounds, specifically religious ones and not just Mormons, do tend to have an idea anyway that their sexuality is more concerning or more upsetting than kind of the general population, right? So, and I think one of the struggles that we face as clinicians, especially Mormon clinicians, is how do we validate people's concerns and perspectives about their sexuality versus what's considered maybe clinically relevant versus what's a values discrepancy between, like what would be considered maybe normal behavior, but it doesn't fit or align with your ideas of how you should be behaving sexually. So right off the bat, let's just jump into that hot water and talk about how you conceptualize that, and then we'll get into the program that's been created.
One thing that stands out to me there, Natasha, is that whereas I have found LDS couples are quite reluctant to address sexuality and sexual difficulties directly, and so it is not often a presenting problem. And so for the first number of years, many years for me as a therapist, I would address it when couples brought it up, but I would not very often ask them about their sexuality. And whereas with pornography issues, I think somebody seeing an LDS person seeing a therapist is much more likely to bring that up as a presenting problem. So it's much more upfront and right there. Either way, though, I think addressing and talking very directly and openly about sexuality, asking those seeking therapy about sexuality, whether they're single or married, whether about their sexual relationship or any issues they're dealing with their sexuality, I think can be very helpful. So I think that's just kind of a key learning I've had through the years.
Mm-hmm.
Michael, any thoughts about that? Any thoughts from you as far as this idea between values discrepancies and clinical judgments and clinical criteria for disorders, for example?
I think it's really notable that the DSM-5 chose not to include sexuality as a form of addiction, even though it included, for example, caffeine addiction this time.
It sure did. Those 5-hour wake-up calls. What are those called? The monsters and boy, caffeine has gotten a lot more. Caffeine on steroids is much more available than just coffee these days. That seems.
Yeah, I don't know. But I think it's. I like to think about that. The fact that, okay, caffeine is now in the DSM-5, but not sexuality, right? Even though there was quite a big push to do that by different people and groups, the research seemed to be pretty clear that it acted more as a compulsion for people. And so it's being treated, at least through that manual, more like kind of a compulsive action rather than an addictive action. So anyway, I'm not sure what.
No, and I really appreciate you saying that. I think sometimes the audience might be like, well, who cares what we call it, and I would just say right from the get-go, well, you treat compulsions differently than you treat addiction. So that's one reason why.
Addiction, it's villainized right away. It becomes the enemy, right, of what you're fighting against. Most addiction language includes some form of like fighting, some form of like really trying to transform your life away from an addiction. Your life becomes quite dedicated in some ways towards a flight of health away from an addiction. And so especially early on in our groups, we determined together we're not going to treat the sexual problems that we saw and concerns like that. And APA has really kind of followed suit, or I think we're following along kind of ABA guidelines with regard to that.
Yeah, and that's what's, I guess, so impressive to me, because these programs were being developed at a time when we didn't have as much information about whether or not to take an addictions route or not. So the fact that, a program at BYU of all places did not follow the addiction route just seemed very impressive to me.
Well, thank you. When I was a graduate student at the University of Georgia, I worked full-time for a couple of years in an adult psychiatric hospital on the substance abuse unit. And those 2 years taught me a lot about what we're talking about and the kinds of threats, the kind of consequences, right, for addiction. And when I saw what people were going through and presenting with sexual concerns at BYU, that did not look, I mean, yeah, you could invent very big problems if you want to like see them through certain lenses, right? But in terms of real consequences and real, very life and death kind of matters, it did not look like that. And so that entered into my thinking, having had that kind of experience.
That's really interesting. That's a similar experience to me as well. I started off my career working for 2 years in a substance abuse clinic, mainly with opiate addiction, So I was kind of teased that, first of all, heroin doesn't know if you're Mormon or not. Pornography seems to. And I also tease that I don't know that I've seen anybody, like throwing up in my office or with shakes or things like that. Like I've seen my opiate addicts, very much have done that in my office with me. So that's, it's very, so, and let's talk a little bit about compulsion, because again, there's diagnostic criteria or even values discrepancy issues possibly here, right? So it's very common, at least in my practice, to see a young man, for example, who's maybe trying to prepare to go on his mission, and he's, coming in with a sexual concern that he's, having problems stopping masturbating. He reports that he's masturbating about once a month, looking at pornography once a month about the time that he masturbates, and he feels like he fits the criteria for a compulsion. And so this is where I just want to, talk about where there are criteria for compulsive behaviors. And then there's also this, values discrepancy that still causes a lot of distress for people, right? So his mission is on the line. He feels badly because he feels like he's acting in ways that go against his own values and his own desires of how he wishes he would be able to manage his sexuality. What are some thoughts that the two of you have about that?
Sure. I would say with our students struggling usually with pornography use, masturbating to pornography, I think they assume right from the get-go this is a very serious problem. They've got an addiction. It's a very serious mental health issue. They desperately need help. And so they're coming in often at a very high distress level, or there are people in their lives who are highly distressed by their behavior. Maybe a bishop or a parent or a spouse or a girlfriend or something. And so there's a there's a big discrepancy right there from the start that they're assuming I have a very serious problem. They often will call it an addiction, make a lot of assumptions about this being really high severity. And it seems like a lot of what we're doing with the sexual concerns groups is to help educate some and help them understand sexuality and help them oftentimes understand this difference between habits, maybe compulsive behavior, and then full-blown addiction, which is something quite different.
Anything you'd add to that, Michael? I thought that was really good.
That sounded just right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Well, then, Michael, why don't you start off by talking a little bit about the history then of how this whole program got started?
Okay. So like I said, I joined the faculty in 1999. And for a year or two, there, periodically I'd get somebody, a young man usually, would come in and just say that he was looking at pornography on the internet, and or masturbation was talked about, I think, quite a bit more in those times, or at least it was perceived by at least some people, or maybe more of a majority of people, as being quite a spiritual problem. And so, but then again, as the internet was just becoming much more integrated, availability, AOL, is that what we used to use? And then it went from
right.
kind of easier streaming, easier access, all those things. We just started seeing more and more people come in with this. It was apparent that the bishops of these young men, again, mainly young men, were being inundated, and some of them were being sent to the counseling center. And, I don't think I ever once at the University of Georgia ever had one discussion with anybody about this sort of treatment, for this kind of thing. So a number of us were just sort of scrambling a bit. The obvious idea was to sort of treat it like an addiction, or to move towards an addiction model. LDS Family Services was definitely operating using that kind of a model, and beginning to put things, workbooks and things like that together, programs. But we were in a unique environment. We're an academic environment. We're also a clinical environment of licensed clinicians. And so we have just this sort of other opportunity. And the opportunity we decided to use was to have group therapy, rather than just lead support groups, in which the therapist has much less of a role. We decided that we would actually start a therapy group, because we have the advantage of having trained, licensed and experienced therapists leading them.
So this whole kind of theme, again, obviously started in the late 90s, maybe early 2000s, as the internet was taking off. Obviously, pornography or sexually explicit materials were becoming much more readily available. Now you're seeing more people, in particular in this church community, feeling guilty badly about that doesn't fit their values. So they're coming in distressed about these kinds of things. It sounds like too, there was some history about BYU also themselves, monitoring computer behavior, as far as,
right.
and whether or not those people would get turned into the honors office. Can you expand on that? Is that something that's still happening?
As far as I know, it's not happening like it used to. One of the ways I think BYU responded or reacted was to monitor what people were looking at on the computer, on BYU's computers, especially in the library or other group settings of computer use.
And to be fair, so do other libraries, and so do other workplaces. I'm not trying to say BYU was doing something necessarily weird here or anything.
I don't think so either. I think it was just sort of a phase of time. I don't know how much of that's happening anymore, but for a period of time, they got busted, right, and referred to Honor Code, and Honor Code would routinely send them down to our center, and then we would encourage them to go to a group. That no longer happens, to where they're getting monitored online, or at least in a way that they know, or get referred to the Honor Code office or something. So we no longer get referrals like that, as far as I know, Marty.
Right.
Yeah, that probably happened for a 5-year period, something like that,
Okay.
maybe.
Okay.
And
Well, and
if
it
I
was,
understand, real
go
quick,
ahead.
if I understand correctly, often it was student workers in the computer labs that were basically had to be the police and turn people in. And many of them, eventually said, I can't do this. I can't walk around and see if people are looking at porn or not and turn them in. Plus, many of them sometimes would have their own issues with porn, and they were very conflicted about it all.
Mhm.
And so it was just kind of a big mess.
Okay.
Yeah, there were
Because,
real consequences too. Like, for example, in the engineering department, if they got caught like that, they would have their ID revoked for a year,
mm,
meaning they had to set aside their program for a year before they could. And so many of those students were coming in saying, I need help to, to get reinstated. So there were some like really meaty consequences in those days
right.
for this kind of behavior.
Well, and unfortunately, I mean, I'm sure you're both aware of the video that came out really just, I think, last year, but it was BYU, Idaho, where it came out of from, where it felt like there was this kind of push to encourage students to turn each other in. Like if your roommate was looking at,
Right.
materials or things like that. So, but that didn't come out of BYU, Utah that I'm aware of.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's kind of that got a lot of critique, mainly because of, again, the what you're saying, it kind of pits people against each other, and they maybe just kind of creates a little bit of a snitchy mess. My kids keep on saying, can't be a snitch. I'm like, well, let's talk
Yeah.
about that. That's complex, but
Right.
for the
Right.
most part, who wants to be the
Yeah.
snitch on their roommate looking at
Well,
porn?
and it very much goes against the model we're trying to promote, which is, hey, if talk to each other, open a dialogue that isn't based on getting someone in trouble or with a superior, but
Right.
based on opening up the whole dialogue that everybody's going through this more or less. And
Well, so
a
let's
lot of
move into
sources
that
support.
model that, like, so, when you think about, okay, what are we treating and how do we go about, how do we decide, you're saying, well, we decide not to go down the addiction route. Tell me a little bit about how this whole kind of treatment modality for the group therapy sessions started out. What thought process went into that?
All right. To this day, our sexual concerns groups are based fundamentally, the way we treat is through acceptance and commitment therapy, which I'll refer to as ACT is the abbreviation of that. And the reason we chose that model was because one of the three of us that was really working on brainstorming what we would do, Kirk Dewar had done his PhD at the University of Nevada, Reno, where Steve Hayes is, and he's the founder of that model. And so Kirk had learned and was practicing that model. He was training us in the use of that model in other therapy contexts. And we began really thinking about using that model in this context, because it's really good at working through kind of compulsive behaviors and anxiety based behaviors, which of course guilt, shame thrives sort of in that environment. And it became pretty easy for us to begin putting this together and think through how we were going to apply that model. Since then, I think our overall approach has really broadened to include other elements as we've learned over time. And I think our first group began in like 2001 with maybe just a handful of people. Rick Moody, Kirk Dewar were leading that group. Pretty soon that we got enough people to do 2 groups, and I joined them. And next thing you know, we were within a few years, we had hundreds of people, not in any one group, but we had hundreds of people a year trying to get into the groups. The group size was anywhere from about 10, and there were occasionally when we had up to like 25 people, and we would start a new group every month. So the
groups would last for like a certain amount of time, or?
So since it's a university counseling center, they would last from whenever they would start to the end of that semester or term. and then it would end, and then a new one would begin, after that. So they were anywhere from like maybe 8 weeks up to 14, 15 weeks.
Okay.
I think I would say just too, another context with all this is that in the late 90s and through the 2000s, there was a lot of general conference talks and ensign messages and stuff that were very strongly warning about pornography use and very strong condemnation of using pornography and how severe it can be, and that it's like a plague, and that it can damage spirituality and family and marriage and everything. And I know, Mike, you've said often, and Rick Moody has told me as well, that you guys would often see a surge in people wanting to do the group following certain general conference talks or ensign articles.
Yeah. Having a group begin, middle of April, middle of October, those groups usually got pretty full.
Yeah.
People's consciences being kind of pricked, and
it seems like,
bless their hearts, they come in and really try to work on it.
Yeah, and it seems like that has shifted. The rhetoric and the teaching.
Can I say something else in addition to that, Marty?
Sure.
During the exact time you're talking about, when I first started working at BYU, in that first decade especially, in addition, there were quite a few people coming into the counseling center wanting to change their sexual orientation.
Yeah.
Right?
I definitely wanted to talk about this because I know it's a higher risk for gay and lesbian students to fall into the addictions model in conservative cultures.
Oh, very much so. And it was routine to have like a new student come into counseling, sit down confidentially and ask me or ask another, their counselor, how I've heard that you can change your sexual orientation. Please help me to do that. And so just a lot of fear, anxiety, and I think just a lot of unknown at that point about how to handle sexuality generally, other than through like pretty strict repentance, strict sort of change models, very dualistic things. So I just want to say it was part of a larger culture, larger issues as well.
Did you want to continue a thought, Marty?
No, other than now, I think that rhetoric, that highly warning, alarm, pornography, plague teaching seems like has kind of shifted and changed through the years, and so there doesn't seem to be as dire of warnings. I've heard many young men in SC groups talk about, as a teenager or even as a young adult years ago, of often kind of dreading priesthood session because there would be some sort of very, very strict warning about pornography, and then they would feel really bad about it because of their ongoing habit with it.
Yeah, the other thing that was really affecting us a lot in the BYU Counseling Center was we were dealing with a lot of young men. Again, I keep saying young men. That's mainly what we're talking about, who were trying to get out on missions, and there was a lot of variation between bishops, stake presidents, in terms of what the criteria was to be able to be worthy to go on a mission. Some only had to sort of refrain for like maybe a few weeks or something, maybe a month, and others like 6 months. If they slipped up by masturbating or looking at pornography, they were back at like day one. And it was highly discouraging, for a subset of students, and getting them very depressed and discouraged. So there was, I don't hear a lot of that now. I'm not sure what the criterias are. I think that they're encouraged to, operate the same way to get out on a mission. But of course, they're going out on missions now before they even come to BYU in a lot of cases. So I don't hear quite as much of that fear and consequences I used to.
That's interesting. I mean, yeah, I think that the age change could be part of that. And I wonder what makes you think, Marty, that the rhetoric around pornography is lessening some. I mean, I do remember Oaks coming out with a statement about a year or two ago, kind of spectruming pornography use for the first time. It wasn't just like all, usually before then, all pornography was treated the same, whereas he kind of started talking about, people who maybe intermittently may watch something versus people who are more regular. So it was the first time that there seemed to be something spectrumed over the pulpit. Is that kind of what you're referring to?
Yes, and I think that's been really helpful to SC group members. I will often send them that article and bring it up in the group and just see what people think of it and explore it. I think before that time, there was a very real fear that there's really kind of two types of young adult men in the church, those who don't use pornography and those who are addicted to it. And that's it. And I think that was that binary thinking and pretty extreme thoughts and feelings about it for a lot of these young men at this developmental time of life, I think was very, very hard. And I think that has eased up a bit. And I think we understand now, pornography use is really widespread. Some people, it's much more serious habit. Other people, it's more occasional. Some people don't really struggle with it much. And there's many different ways to go with it. And we've heard a lot of church leaders, Elder Oaks, Elder Ballard, I think a couple others say, hey, this is a serious problem, but don't give up on a friend or a son or daughter. Don't give up on a boyfriend or girlfriend because of these issues. They're things that can be worked with.
Yeah, it's been more contextualized and probably a lot more made room for compassion as well. To some degree normalized, maybe to some degree, given the context of modern society.
And that can sometimes be a good discussion in SC groups around this and their thoughts and feelings about it, because it's so taboo that an open, honest, real discussion about how all the members of the group have felt about this, with the therapist leaders sometimes sharing their own insights like we're doing here, can be really helpful and alleviate a lot of fear and shame and I'm the only one, or everyone else is doing way, way better than me type thinking. And again, that's why group, I think, is so helpful for this.
Because it gives other people's perspectives or allows for dialogue, it sounds like.
Let me say a few more things about how the groups developed. Is that okay?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So we just started putting ourselves in rooms with these young men and occasionally a young woman too. And I started from my treatment days of addiction, right? I started having them like write a small history of their struggle with the issues that they came in with. And they would read those to each other at the beginning of the groups. And that became pretty revealing, right? Of how like the kinds of common experiences people were having. It really informed us as therapists in terms of like what people had experienced, why they'd experienced some of these things, and what their needs were. And one thing that became crystal clear was that the vast majority had come from very conservative homes that had mainly had a lot of trouble bringing up in any kind of very sophisticated or very normal ways human sexuality, other than maybe the talk, right? Or a few talks like that. It was treated as a topic to avoid mainly by a lot of families. And so the amount of sexual training, sexual education, put it that way, sexual education that people were coming in with was just woefully inadequate. Especially if it becomes quite a paradox given the demand that BYU culture, Mormon culture puts on marriage and early marriage. Just how few people were trained very well at all in sexual education to prepare themselves or to normalize their own process. So we had a lot of people just very out of sorts, not knowing how to understand their own human sexuality. That just became very clear to us.
So I'm guessing that's a big part of these, of what you're offering then, is psychoeducation or sexual education in kind of been?
I remember like the first time after a number of these groups, I'm like, okay, I'm going to do something different this time. I want you all just to write down 2 or 3 sex questions that you have. And I said, please, ask the most embarrassing one, but also ask the one you're actually the most curious about, because we want their curiosity to be freed up in the, in the attempt to understand themselves and understand sexuality. And it was just incredible, some of the things that people were coming up with and the discussions we would have, and the laughter, the relief, the seriousness of people like gaining insights. It was just beautiful to watch, young people freeing themselves up to be able to actually have discussions openly. And I think even more than the information, it was just the fact that they were able to do that and push through avoidance was very freeing for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
So we include that now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And to your point, do women and men attend these groups together then, or do you separate them out, or how does that?
No, they attend together.
Okay.
We don't often get women. It's kind of rare for us to get women to attend. We've tried a number of efforts in the past to try to increase women participation, tried to hold a women's only group at one point, which didn't quite get off the ground. And so that's a challenge for us. When we do have 1 or 2 women, especially one woman, say one woman with 8 guys, that's a little intimidating for that woman, I think. And so there's some challenges there.
Do you have female therapists as well that offer these groups that are part of the group therapy process? Yeah.
It's been about 2/3 men though, and 1/3 women running the groups probably.
Yeah, we usually do co-therapy. There's usually more than one leader.
Mm-hmm.
We've had a lot of interns and practicum students, as well as other female faculty members, co-lead groups over time. So
good. All right. Well, why don't we get into why don't you briefly talk us through what, if I wanted to attend a group, what would that look like? What would you want to make sure I understood was part of the process? Walk us through some of these sessions, what you're offering, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Marty, maybe we can go back and forth on this.
Sure.
Okay. So when people come in to CAPS, our counseling center, it's required that they have a one-on-one session with one of our therapists in which we just go through their issues, try to understand their needs, and either see them individually for therapy or maybe refer them to a group if they're willing to join a group. Pretty standard that if somebody comes presenting and their primary concern is like pornography use, something related like that, that we're going to refer them to the group. Again, the demand has been so high in the past that it's a better treatment model anyway, usually.
Yeah.
So, and then they'll join a group. It's a confidential group, and we make that very clear. Kind of the requirements of confidentiality for all of us.
Meaning that it also includes the honor code office. There's no reporting of what they're going to say to the school.
Absolutely. Our administration is not asking us who's in these groups or anything. The honor code office is not knocking on our door. They give us the respect that we need and deserve to be able to successfully treat people and work with people. Mm-hmm. So I think all groups are respectful of those boundaries. And so a person can come to CAPS and expect complete confidentiality from their ecclesiastical leader or anyone else, their parents, anyone.
Right. And BYU CAPS has always done a lot of group therapy. There just happens to be a few key researchers at BYU who research group therapy, national, international researchers. And so CAPS has always done a lot of group therapy. And so we're very used to referring students to group.
Yeah.
Great. No, I think that's really important I mean, I would assume that to be the case just from legal and ethical standards, but I think since you are a religious university, that it's important people know that those things are honored.
Especially, right?
Yes.
Especially true where privacy is such a, I don't know, people have different views of privacy and what privacy means, right? Sometimes culturally.
Sure.
So that's something we're very clear about and want help to people feel safe to share whatever they need to in groups. The other thing that we make clear is that it's a clinical environment that they're entering. This isn't a spiritually based treatment. It's a clinically based treatment. So we're there for their psychological well-being. And so that usually has to be talked about, cleared up, what that means, because they've often never been exposed to that, any kind of therapy or treatment. But since we're clinicians, we have the opportunity to do that. So that's one thing I'm very clear about. We're going to talk about your sexuality from a clinical and health standpoint, rather than so much from a moral standpoint. So that's a shift for people.
And do you get pushback from that? Is that like these young adults are expecting you to be in accordance with their values and talk about it from a spiritual lens, especially at a place like BYU, where I remember anyway, a lot of things were talked about from a spiritual lens. Right. Even classes that weren't necessarily religion classes were incorporating spiritual aspects, right? And so,
right. So we're not preventing that. We're certainly not preventing them, and they're going to discuss their values during the group. That's actually a big part of the ACT therapy, is discussion of values and working towards your values. So it's not divorced of what their values are, but they're also young people, in which they've been handed a set of values, naively thinking maybe that they are their own values, but maybe haven't gone through the full process. Certainly they have not gone through the full process of examining those values, seeing how those values can be difficult sometimes to live or to think through before you really take a full ownership of those values. So we kind of have them in that time period where that's naturally happening. And that's very rich and dynamic clinically.
I love that. Yes.
I'll just piggyback on two things that Mike's mentioned as well. When it comes to discussing religion and spirituality, I like to open it very clearly to them by saying something to the effect of, we want you to talk about religion, spirituality, your own faith, your own values, your own beliefs, in whatever ways you would like to, as it may apply to your sexual concerns. And we don't want you to be reluctant to share any of that, but we want you to speak for yourself. Don't speak in the royal we. Don't assume that everybody thinks and believes like you. And then I especially like to note, and don't assume that others should believe like you do. And that's the challenge I find with SC group members. I think they're very respectful of, okay, yeah, everybody's got different beliefs. Sure, I can understand that. Yeah, we can talk about religion here. But most group members will need to be reminded, don't assume that others should believe and think like you do. It comes across as a bit preachy. It shuts down conversation. It makes some group members unable to talk about some of their fears or concerns around their sexual concern, especially as it relates to religion, to Mormonism, to BYU culture and such.
I love that. I think that's so important, and not a skill that we're often taught in our Mormon kind of, upbringings, where we do take a pretty strong position that people should think like we do. Right. So in some ways, you're kind of teaching them a whole nother way of framing.
Right.
Especially around the fact that they're often returned missionaries, and they're very used to, and they're transitioning often, kind of back into civilian life. And it's a little mind blowing for them to have to really sit with those things.
Yeah. And it's the same with from the clinical perspective, as Mike mentioned. We try to emphasize with them, this is clinical group therapy. You're going to talk about your sexuality. You're going to talk about your thoughts and feelings, your struggles, your issues, your fears, your insecurities, your hopes. And we're not going to use 12-step language because many of the SC members have been involved in LDS 12-step addiction and recovery program stuff. Not all of them, but it's quite common. And we don't want them to use that language. And I always say, not because it's not helpful, it's great stuff. It's very helpful. There's some beautiful ideas there that can be very meaningful for people, but we're not utilizing that as a treatment model here. This is not 12-step. There's therapists here. This is not a support group. It's group therapy. And so if you use words like addiction, recovery, relapse, act out, sobriety, sponsor, codependency, we're going to ask you, what do you mean by that? Please tell us more what that means.
I love it. Yes, because there's also the argument that those words can be harmful, especially if they're lifelong words that you're, integrating into your sexual identity. So,
I'd say that's the heartbreaking thing for me, was to see these young people come in over and over and over again to this day, believing that their sexuality, that their sexual development is equated to an addiction, is maybe the single most harmful thing I've seen.
Yeah,
because
it seems that when you add fear and shame to sexual development and these issues around like pornography use, I think that's just gasoline on the fire of just making everything worse. So I often encourage the group to encourage some discussions around both fear and shame and how that is very problematic in terms of their sexuality, their identity, their sense of worth, their sense of worthiness spiritually, their sense of lovableness. Those are rich discussions.
Right. All right. So moving into then, so you kind of have these introductions, kind of set up the guidelines, the rules. It sounds like, you're talking to them about how we're going to engage together. How do you start kind of incorporating ACT? I know that Marty, in your presentation, you talked about starting with this person in the hole or shovel metaphor. Is that a good place to kind of get the discussion going on what treatment looks like?
Sure. I'll just mention that briefly. So acceptance and commitment therapy has typically utilized a lot of metaphors, especially when it was newer. It seems that the idea was to have a big collection of metaphors to use for individual group therapy. And this person in the hole metaphor seems quite effective for the sexual concern problem. So after we discuss everything, all the introductory stuff, we do this metaphor, which I'll just give a brief review of it. You're in a field, you've got a blindfold on. It's a beautiful field. Somebody says, hey, go explore this field. You go explore around and you fall into a big hole. And you throw off the blindfold and you realize you're down at the bottom of this hole and you wonder what the heck just happened. And you look around and you can't get out. The where you fell in is too far up and there doesn't seem to be any way out. So you search around, you see off in the corner of this hole an old shovel, and you say, all right, well, I know how to use this shovel. Maybe I can figure some way to get out of this. So you dig and stack dirt and try to figure out various ways to get out of this hole. Make some progress, not that great of progress. Get somebody's attention. They come by and say, what are you doing in this hole? Why are you down there? What happened? I don't know. I fell in this hole. Can you help me get out? They say, I know. I think I know. I know just what you need. So they come back a few minutes later and they say, watch out. This is going to help you out. They throw you down a shovel. And it's better. It's a better shovel. It's sharper. It's not as old. So you say, all right. So you start digging around with this shovel and make some progress. It's better. It's a better shovel. It's working better. Same result. It's not really getting you out of this hole. Hear another person. You get their attention. Hey, I'm down in this hole. Whoa, what happened? Why are you down there? Let me help you. And they say, I know just what you need. And they throw you down a brand new shovel. And they say, I'm sure you can get out of here. You can get out here with this shovel. And so you dig around. It's a better shovel. Things are going better. But when it comes right down to it, you're not really out of the hole. You're kind of stuck in this hole. And sometimes we'll throw out an idea that's dark. Somebody throws you down some type of ladder. You grab it. You start digging with this ladder. And then we just open it up to, is this what your sexual concern feels like? How does this fit? How does this resonate with your experience of your sexual concern. And we just have kind of some big group process on that. And it often resonates quite a bit. Most often people will say that feels a lot like it. That's very similar to working with bishops, family, mission presidents. I've got a lot of tools. I've got a ton of ideas. I'm not really out of this hole. People don't seem to know how to get me out of this hole. It's a big confusion. It's frustration. It's hard. It's difficult. And many will say too something to the effect of, and sometimes I want to be in this hole. Maybe I like to be in this hole. So I don't always want to be out, but then other times I feel terrible about it and I want out of this hole and I don't know what to do. It's a metaphor to really bring about the ACT concept of, the phrase is slipping my mind.
Creative helplessness.
Yeah, creative hopelessness.
And what that really helps and why it's so powerful, I think, in our groups, is that it just helps people to settle into just where they're at, because there's such a cultural force to have an image, to sort of quickly be where you're supposed to be. And in the group, what we're trying to help promote is for people just to be really right where they are. And we can work with right where you're at rather than where you feel like you should be by next week or something.
Yeah. And I think there's lots of aspects of the ACT model that I really enjoy as well. And it's this idea of, in some ways, and I think you use this language too in your presentation, Marty, it's like an unwinnable struggle, right? So like your sexual drive, your sexual interests, your sexual tastes and preferences, and so much of that is involuntary, is not, happening because you say, oh, I'm waking up today and I want to think about this, or I want to, it's like so much of it is just, and I think that's true of so many human aspects, not just our sexuality. And I think here in the United States, we tend to be very goal-oriented, very change-driven, very behavioral driven. And that's the measure of success, is getting your behavior to somehow match what this ideal vision you have of yourself. And the reality is that so many of us fail at that type of attempt. And then what ends up happening is that people just feel more and more worthless, because as you're doing the shovel metaphor, it's like every single time it didn't work. Well, then it must be, it's not the shovel's fault. It's not the hole's fault. It's my fault, right? Is kind of what people tend to start. And then, increase in depression, increase in anxiety, increase in kind of the behavior that already has you upset to begin with. I usually have this relationship with donuts, I say, right? Anytime I'm super motivated about not doing donuts, I do donuts more. It's unwinnable. It's unwinnable.
Yeah.
The fact that we're human is unwinnable.
Right. Yes. And we present them with that. At the end of that, I like to say, you guys are smart, you're bright, you're here at BYU, you're spiritually, religiously oriented, because many of them said they've served missions and stuff. And I just say, why are you not out of this hole? What's going on? To help them to kind of feel that sense of they've worked very, very hard. They've been very creative, and it's not changing. It's this unwinnableness, that the paradigm is not working.
Yeah, so then from then on, a lot of the metaphors that we use and the different phases of therapy are about diffusing that sense of shame, that high sense of guilt, settling into the conflict, right? So what is group therapy but dealing with conflicts, right? And exposing them, getting them out, normalizing them to a large degree. And the universality, right, of people, especially in an SC group, of people sharing such things that have been so privately shaming, and now hearing that their peers are experiencing very similar things, people that they actually really respect, begins to turn it on maybe the possibility of self-respect, right? Including the self-respect that this is a long journey. And so a lot of the metaphors go from there to shame reduction, and towards beginning to open up more of discussions about values, things that they believe in, things that they're working toward in their life, instead of what they're working against, i.e. the pornography problem. What are you, the central frame is like, what are you working toward in your life? It's not too great to have a negative goal of what you're trying not to do. Much better to have goals and be working towards things that you do value and want in your life. And in these groups, a lot of that has to do with intimacy, relationships. They're in that Ericksonian phase of trying to enter into and understand intimate relationships and what that's going to mean to them. So again, there's a lot to discuss and help people to open up.
Yeah, my understanding is that ACT stands for Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, correct? Right. So it's merging these two ideas of which sometimes I think we think are non-mergeable. If I accept something, that means it's not going to change. It's how can I accept something and have committed, action towards change? Can you talk a little bit about how the marrying of those two concepts?
Sure.
Why they tend to work?
I would say there's always that in the background because most of these SC guys they're very distressed by this problem. There's a lot of shame and fear. They're very, very concerned and they've been dealing with it for a long time. I've almost never had an SC group member where the problem is a year or two. It's always since they were 10 or 12 or something. And,
since puberty.
Right, exactly. And so a big focus is to help them find that sense of acceptance of their sexuality, acceptance of their thoughts and their feelings, acceptance of that life is challenging and a struggle, as you said earlier, Natasha, the kind of the unwinnableness of what they're doing. And then to really move toward what are my values? What do I really value in my heart of hearts? What do I really want? How do I want to make sense of this? And so we do some metaphors. The ACT bus driver metaphor is a good one that's all about values. You're driving your bus. There's a lot of people on your bus that are yelling at you or trying to get you to go different directions. Those are thoughts, feelings, life experiences, memories, such that are trying to dissuade you and get you going different directions. Ultimately, though, you get to decide. And where are you driving to? And that's all about values. That's all about what are the values I want to live for today? Do I want to live for trying to end pornography in this little corner of my life, or do I want to live the rest of my life for the things that are most meaningful and important to me? And can I do both? I think that's often a big question in these groups. Can you date or develop greater intimacy with like with a girlfriend, or do your best in school, or be really committed to church things and have this sexual concern? Can you hold those both? And is that okay? And to have them kind of wrestle with that. Because a lot of times they feel like one has to cancel out the other in a binary way. Well, I'm struggling with porn, so I can't date, or I can't move toward marriage, or I can't do well in school, or I'm really just not a good person because I have this sexual concern problem. We want them to be able to kind of gracefully hold both together.
Yeah, that takes a lot of maturing. And in SE groups, it was a lot like watching popcorn kernels go off over time. Some people, that pops really pretty soon. They make this connection that Marty's talking about. Oh, I can live inside this dilemma. I don't have to just live in such a dualistic way as to think that it's an either or situation. But some people just are stuck in that duality, right? Mm-hmm. The idea, they'll say like, this is all well and good. I like all these principles and ideas. Now just help me to stop doing this, right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Because I've got a temple deadline coming up, or I've got something else coming up. And
right. That's a real issue in our culture. Mm-hmm. Especially when those decisions are being in some way navigated by other people who have power to keep you from the temple, right? Or keep you from your mission, or maybe a family member or a future spouse who says, well, if you don't get this under control and can tell me this won't be an issue, we're not getting married, right? Or so it's not just even educating your people in your group. It's like our whole culture needs this type of education.
And for
I
whatever,
really like the way Jennifer Finlayson Fife talks about this too, very unapologetically, that human sexuality just pulls out and requires you to think more sophisticatedly, to think more as an adult, and really enter into the human dilemmas, including the relational dilemmas, right, in which people weigh in with different expectations with each other. It really pulls on us to mature and to develop our own capacities to deal with all kinds of messages that we hear.
Yeah, that's powerful. I'll mention the poignancy, I think, comes about when there's a young man trying to go on a mission, and maybe he's delayed a mission for a year because he keeps struggling with these issues, and either he doesn't want to go or his bishop doesn't want him to go or something like that. And then often even more poignant, in every group I've run, almost every time there's at least one married guy whose spouse is kind of freaked out by the fact that he continues to masturbate to porn or have some issues like this. And it brings out a poignant, kind of scary, hard thing. I'm remembering one time a guy came to group, he had missed, we'd only had like 3 or 4 groups and he had missed 2 of them, I think. He came into group, he was super sad. Group eventually moved to him. He said, my wife caught me looking at porn last night. She's super angry and pissed at me. And you know, he was crying and sad. And everyone in the group, including me, started giving him a lot of, oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. Like, this is these guys' greatest fear, I think, that their spouse is going to reject them because of this problem. And so we were all kind of giving him a lot of comfort. And luckily, my co-leader, who was a student, kind of stood up and said, what are we all so scared about? Why is everybody so scared right now? And kind of brought up that we're all kind of participating in this fear-shame cycle that these guys are constantly in. I was so glad he stood up and did that. And then we had a richer process around, why is this so scary for these guys?
Yeah, it's really, it's unfortunate that, I mean, I could give several reasons why it's scary. Like, you know, like, I mean, like on the one hand, I understand what you're saying, right? Like, we have to mature into our adult selves. This is an invitation. I totally agree with Jennifer's statement, you know, like all of a sudden we have to, it forces us to move away from binaries, like you're saying. And at the same time, even though that you can say things are getting a little bit better or, et cetera. Things happen in our culture all the time that make this fear a real reality. People do get divorced over this issue. People do get kicked out of BYU for this issue. People do lose their jobs over this issue, especially in church kind of, you know, functional jobs. People don't get to go on their missions because of this issue. So the consequences are very scary and very real, and it can be quite understandable why people might go into that either self-shame or self-secrecy type of space, which of course we know isn't helpful for mental health, for relational health. And, you know, and women in particular in our culture are taught to be quite upset about this. You know, it's their, in other words, to be a good, righteous Mormon woman, you better hold this man accountable, right, for this type of behavior. They're not necessarily taught a different skill set that, you know, taps more into their empathy or into their own issues that they want empathy about. Or so we have an overall problem as an overall culture. And I'm so glad that the two of you are willing to sit with me and talk about this, because I'm hopeful that if bishops are hearing this, you know, if Relief Society presidents are hearing this, as both men and women parents are hearing this, so we can look at really, you know, here's a program at BYU that isn't measuring success by behavioral reduction. You're measuring success by maturing, by looking at, you know, how do we integrate our values in a more robust, energetic way that isn't just completely tied to whether or not our behavior matches up all the time, because then we all fail at everything. So maybe talk a little bit about that. How do you when people leave your program, how do you measure, okay, this was successful, this, or at least this led people into a healthier type of approach with themselves, with their sexuality, and hopefully also within their relationships, even maybe within their relationship with Mormonism itself?
Yeah, great question.
Yeah, I think I would say that in terms of a clinical level, the people that participate in these groups tend to not be overly psychologically diminished in our groups to begin with. And they don't, they leave in a tend to leave in a pretty good place with regard to their own symptoms. They're not overly depressed usually, not overly anxious, just feeling a lot of guilt and shame around these issues. So just from a clinical level, they tend to leave at a pretty good rate. And I'd say psychologically, they often express that there's a lot more to this than simply ending a behavior out of fear.
Mm-hmm.
A lot more to this. It's given them a lot more inner permission to explore the issues that are involved and to give themselves enough space to where they can be more agentic with themselves and with the people around them, be more authoritative in their own lives, and the room that's required to navigate these dilemmas. Those are the main things that I'm looking for.
I would say the same. I'd say the very same, and that they have some ways to address this problem that isn't about simply trying to shut it down or trying to behaviorally control it, but that's about acceptance, awareness, deeper intimate connection, their own personal values, being able to become more willing to sit with hard things, difficult emotions, understanding their sexuality better, hopefully having a little bit of insight about their developing sexuality and what it can mean to themselves. Those kind of things I think are very key.
So anything that I haven't necessarily asked you about that you were hoping to talk about, but just hasn't come up yet?
I guess two other elements of the group that's we've added over time is much more of a strong mindfulness based. I'd lead every group beginning with a meditation. Sometimes we close the group with a meditation. Just something to help people compose themselves, turn the direction into their body and having greater body awareness, slowing down their process, which I think is so helpful in terms of managing sexual impulses, sexual desires, that having ways and means to slow your process down enough, right? Your body down enough, which just promotes self-awareness much better, gives people a more balanced approach. That's one thing I would say. And then the other is the introduction of the idea of sexual development.
Mm-hmm.
That we really don't imagine any other area that's significantly difficult of our life that doesn't have some kind of a developmental element to it. That we get better and better, more and more skilled at working with complex things. Why do we automatically think that our sexuality has to be just right and it has to stay right and stay in the proper context? When you look at it like that, it becomes easy to see that there's a lot more to this, and it requires an ability to be developmental about it in our approach.
I love that. I think that's, we can't get to perfect quite yet, right? That's
or never.
Or never.
But we can become more skillful at the things that we're doing.
Yeah, I love that. Allie Payne, by the way, is listening, and her comment is, if Joseph Smith had arguably sexual powers and was able to be a prophet, she meant problems. People can have sexual problems and still be good people and be worthy members of God's kingdom. So I think she's, kind of talking about this yes and approach, that we can have issues that we wish we would get better at and are working on, and still date and serve and, go to the temple and things of that nature. So as clinicians, this would be kind of one of my last questions. As clinicians who work at BYU with some of our, youngest and brightest people that are, coming into this, university setting, oftentimes, as you know, the first person that a lot of these people have gone to is the person in the trenches, which is the bishop, right? So, and usually much sooner than at a BYU age, right? So like you're talking about puberty, 13, 14, 15, they're starting to have some of these conversations about sexuality, and sometimes some of their only conversations about sexuality with their bishop. And in particular, in this realm of behavioral, relationship to their sexuality instead of normalizing or developmental. And I know there's all kinds of bishops out there and they do all kinds of different work. And some I think are quite good at normalizing certain things and others are more rigid. And, there's all kinds of experiences out there. If there were people in that role who were listening to us, what would be some words of wisdom or things that you would like to share with somebody who is not trained necessarily in that regard, but usually has the best of intentions in helping our youth and wanting to help them do better in these situations?
I think my biggest hope is for bishops and perhaps Relief Society presidents and parents to understand better that, as we have talked about here today, this is deeper than just a very simple habit that you just have to try hard to stop. And I think that messaging still is quite strong. Some SC group members are feeling deep shame and fear and sometimes some depression over this. Others are cynical and angry. And either way, I think they're tiring of sort of the message of, well, why don't you just stop this and just try a lot harder and use all these behavioral techniques to stop it? And there's got to be something deeper. I think it's much better to see pornography use and sexual concern behavior problems as more symptom of other things rather than as the problem. And so recognizing this is about emotions, identity, development, sexual development, relationships, emotional intimacy, connection, this developmental time period of life as well, I think is a much richer discussion. And I'll say too, I think the language of you better stop this for at least this certain period of time before you can go on a mission, get married, go to your sister's wedding, etc. That seems to be softening a little bit in my experience of SC groups, a little less rigid perhaps than in the past. I know I've worked with probably a handful of bishops that have been bishops that either I've known or that SC group members have known that have said something to the effect of, if you're struggling with pornography use, then I want you to get to the temple as soon as possible, that day if possible, for spiritual help and uplift. Some bishops take that tact, and that seems hopeful to me. I don't know the best way to do it, but that seems a hopeful way to go about it. So I think we're seeing a bit of an expanded view of all of that. I think also in the past, you would hear language at BYU of young women saying, if you're dating a young man, you better ask him about pornography use. And if he's using porn, you better run. And I think that has died out quite a bit. I don't think by and large that's believed as much as it was in the past. And I think there's more of a reality check, much more of a reality check for young men and young women and parents of BYU students that, hey, this is a very, very common problem. This is the majority of young men and a very significant percentage of young women as well. So let's treat it for what it is rather than have a lot of fear and shame around it.
So if I could address that question, and I'll address it from a more macro perspective, more systemically, because I think those are beautiful things one-on-one and with, but if I could change some of the, something more systemically, it would be that it seems like the church is moving in this direction to put more of the load on parents and families to educate their children, to take a responsibility about that, and for spiritual training.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, if we could do that in a way that would encourage sexual training as well. sexual development education. Because I think the model has been that parents are sort of allowed to be shut down and avoidant about the issue. Just go talk to the bishop about it.
Mm.
And then it's sort of private, it's confidential. I don't even have to know much about it, right? I mean, what a horrible model of sexual education, development, advice, restriction, that sort of thing, developing self-control, all the things that it requires. That's a pretty horrible model when you think about it. We can do much better than that. I think we're prepared to do much better than that because Mormon society tends to really emphasize good education. It does not, it doesn't necessarily invite avoidance as a strategy. We can do so much better. So I would say bishops, parents, let's talk together. Bishops, push back on families a little bit. Say, hey, this is more your responsibility than it is mine. And then families and parents, I would say, take responsibility for your own sexual education and how you're going to address those issues with your own children. I see more and more people of the current younger generation really thinking a lot about that. They want a different model. Mm-hmm. They think a lot about how they're going to do it differently with their children. And I think that that's starting to happen more and more. Do not depend on the church to educate your children about sexuality. It's a myth. The church was never there to educate you about sex. It's there to caution you about sex. Like most churches will set forth some cautions and some guidelines, but they're not there to teach you about it and how it works. And so this goes back to families, it goes back to individuals to take it upon themselves. And there's going to be variation from parent to parent, individual to individual in what they think is appropriate and not. And then we're like maturing more when we can acknowledge that we do have some differences, maybe in the way we perceive these things and teach our children. So less centralized views of this and back into our own responsibility.
I love all of those thoughts. Those are wonderful. And I agree. And the first thing I think of is that's more responsibility on parents, which is hard. And I know that there's a lot of differing information out there, right? And so even as you try to do your best as a parent, it can be hard to find resources that, even clinicians might all agree on, right? And so that's a great task. But I would just say, my little
it's
addition.
Can I say that rather than thinking of that as a scary task, it is an amazingly wonderful undertaking.
Yes,
yourself more fully. You have this rich opportunity in 2019, right, to gain information better than you ever have before. So I really want to put a positive spin on that opportunity.
Thank you. No, thank you for that reframe. I think that's wonderful because it is an opportunity to talk to our children, to have a more intimate relationship with our children. And I would just, as a sex therapist myself, just say focus on sex positivity, not just behaviors, not just certain, again, a lot of times when we think about sexual education of kids, we're talking about pornography, we're talking about what not to do. Talk to them about the richness of sexuality, the normalcy of sexuality, what you can expect at different developmental stages. Understand that your child is a sexual being, whether you're comfortable with them being that or not, and that doesn't just automatically turn on at marriage. So how do we manage our sexuality in ways that also align with values, which is also something that we're very much teaching as parents and as societies and as churches and all of that. So it is an exciting opportunity. So yeah, don't get overwhelmed by something that can seem overwhelming, but that like Michael is saying is actually a wonderful thing that if you engage in, you'll have wonderful benefits of. All right. Any closing thoughts from either one of you?
Sure. I'll say similar, Natasha, that I think one of the systemic changes I would love to see is more of a move to a broader understanding of any kind of sexual behavior problems, but especially in terms of compassion. So compassion from bishops or leaders, parents, compassion from friends, from any support people, rather than kind of maybe a little bit of a fear or a slight shock or disgust response. and then especially a movement more toward anybody struggling with pornography issues or anybody struggling with just sexual behavior problems of any kind, which is most all of us at various times in our life. That's almost virtually everybody. To incorporate and foster a deeper self-compassion, to move toward, this is part of the human struggle. This is there's some suffering, there's some pain, there's some heartache, there's some confusion around all of this. And may I be more kind and compassionate and loving and forgiving toward myself. That's where I'm going to find more strength and courage and energy and hope.
And for me, I'd say,
yes.
Yeah, wonderful. For me, I would say the responsibility to learn, to educate, to try to understand and experience. I wish it would lead people to be just 10 to maybe 15% more sexy in their lives.
I love it.
Yeah.
Just find a style, find a way of engaging that's just a little sexier. And it can be lighter, more fun, more engaging.
Yes.
Very, very positive for human beings.
I love that, Mike. I'm glad that you said that. Let me share one other quick thing. I was doing an SC group with Mike many years ago, and there was a young man who, he had a lot to say. He was a passionate kid. He kind of had a lot of passion about him. He was a handsome kid. And one day he was in group just talking about some of his struggles in more of this kind of heavy way and kind of saying something about how sex is so alluring to him, but how he's struggling with this problem. And Mike just kind of leaned in and said, "You're a really sexy guy, aren't you?" And the guy was kind of shocked, like, yeah, I guess. I just thought it was great. I've always remembered that. And I think, Mike, you were just pointing out that, this was a sexually passionate guy. This was a guy that sex was passionate and beautiful and exciting to him. So of course, that was a good reframe.
I love that. I'm all about us owning and wearing our sensuality, our sexuality, feeling sexy. And that doesn't need to mean how culture defines sexy, right? That's how we get to define it. So that's beautiful. And you heard it here from two BYU clinicians. Get sexy, people. All right. Well, I thank you so much for your time. I again just want to, give my support and my respect for a program that I think, in a certain cultural environment can be challenging. And yet I think that you've done a beautiful, inclusive, comprehensive job of really helping so many of our young adults start their lives at a developmental time, which I think is very important to, start heading down a more sexually healthy and sexual positive way. So I can't thank you both enough for the work that you do and wish you both much success. Anything that you want to say as far as how to contact you or resources or things that you're involved with that maybe, if you want to market anything, please feel free
go
to
see
mention
Marty.
it.
Go see Marty. That's what I'd say. It's terrific.
Marty, where's your individual practice again? If somebody's interested in contacting you or one of the people you work with, how can they contact you?
Sure. Yeah, I work part-time at BYU and then in a group practice in Alliance Behavioral Psychology in Orem.
Okay.
And it's alliancebehavioralpsychology.com.
Okay, thank you. And then Michael, you're full-time at BYU, is that correct?
Yeah, I have a little private practice, but I just mainly see BYU students. So,
okay. All right, great. And there's, like I said, there's these sexual concerns groups at BYU, so people should be aware of that. There's also premarital counseling groups that are available. Anything else you'd want to say about the CAPS program as far as helping people know what the CAPS program offers or does?
Well, it's very comprehensive, right? We have a lot of individual, couples, group therapy. It's a great counseling center, really terrific. And it's very well supported by our administration. So it's a great place.
And that's available to students.
And confidentiality. I want to stress confidentiality.
Yes.
It really does exist there.
And that's available to BYU students, faculty, or just students mainly?
Just students.
Okay. Okay. So that's a great benefit to anybody who's attending BYU schools. All right. Well, thank you for your time. I hope our paths cross again very soon. I love any time I get to spend with either one of you. Again, if you are one who listens to Mormon Mental Health or Mormon Sex Info, please consider financially supporting either podcast. And maybe other ways, if you want to support, is to like the pages or to give a review. So those are other ways that you can support as well, because I love bringing about all these kinds of hopefully informational topics that are helpful to a variety of aspects of either mental health within Mormonism or sexuality. So thank you very much. And everybody have a great day. Take care.
Thank you, Natasha, very much.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Mental Health Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please help us and become a monthly subscriber at mormonmentalhealth.org. The goals of this podcast include education, advocacy, and the mental health and general well-being of Mormons and their families. We can't further this work without your support. Music for this episode was provided by the Lower Lights.
Over life's tempestuous sea, chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me, unknown ways before me roll, hiding rock and treacherous shoal, chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me.
Her child, thou canst touch the ocean wild, wondrous sovereign of the sea. Jesus, Savior, pilot me. Boisterous wave, obey thy will, when thou sayest to them, be still. Wondrous sovereign of the sea, Jesus, Savior, pilot me. When at last I near the shore, and the fearful breakers roar, may I hear thee say to me, fear not, I will pilot thee. Twixt me and the peaceful rest, then while leaning on my breast, may I hear thee say to me, fear not,